thank you for coming in, and to the people online as well. Do you appreciate, the first question, and any of you can answer it, do you appreciate that we talk about CAP as if, you know, you have to do X, Y, and Z environmentally, and in fairness, a lot of farmers are doing things, but do you appreciate that when CAP was negotiated years ago, the CAP was negotiated to bring down the price the farmer was getting for the food that they were producing, but it was subsidised so that people in basically cities or in areas that they may not be able to afford the food was able to afford it. Does everyone recognise that that was the reason CAP was brought in the first place? It wasn't about, you know, what extras were added onto it over the number of years. That was the reason. Does everyone agree that? Una, you might educate me. It's a while since I met you.
Our jobs do that now.
What?
Should have our jobs do that.
Yeah, no, but the birds that say there's birds migrate and come back to Ireland and migrate again and come back. Of the species in this country, what percentage migrate and come back? Just roughly, I'm not tying you down to.
Deputy, you are tying me down to that. I can't actually say. There's 212 regularly occurring species in Ireland, and I wouldn't be able to give you, sorry.
And the ones that are declining, and you'd probably have, you know, you've studied this fairly well. The ones that are declining, are they migrating birds or are they here full time?
Of the 16 farmland birds, there would be a mix of resident species, like red grouse, for example, in the uplands is resident. But curlew, we know also it breeds here, but it also migrates. Yeah, so there would be a mix of both.
And of the migrating species, do we know, or can we put our finger on it? Would it be a problem where they're migrating to, that there's a problem arising, or can we pinpoint it here? You know, like, is it very hard to?
So the 16 farmland birds that I'm talking about are actually breeding here.
Right.
So we can pinpoint.
And what about
that.
the migrating ones?
So there might be a percentage that are breeding and migrating, but those 16 of the farmland birds are ones that we can say for sure that we know, well, that we know what's going on with their populations and that the populations are declining, and that's based on the bird atlas that was done some years ago. Have
you seen, say, under the GLAS scheme, and we talk about the bees, and they're very important, the farmers there was parts of their GLAS that they had to bring out sand in a field and leave it in a corner, right? And maybe farmers are coming up with the wrong conclusion, but say if you push on a field and there was a ditch beside it, and yes, bees increased around it, but some of them were going into the ditch, we'll say, beside it. And I've heard farmers saying that other wildlife like badgers and that were coming along. Would that be a factor?
I'm afraid I'm not a bee expert, Deputy. I wouldn't be able to answer that. But I mean, wildlife is, you know, they all coexist. So, you know, I could imagine that there might have been badgers around, but
I wonder, is there any studies or anything done on basically we improve in a situation, but that some other part of wildlife is harming what we were trying to achieve? Do you know what I mean? That's what I'm trying to.
Oh, so you're saying the badger was.
He was biting into the ditch and getting rid of the bees.
Okay,
I've heard this from several farmers.
Yeah, I mean, that can happen. That can happen. But as long as you have enough habitats for the bees, that shouldn't, you know, some badger snuffling around shouldn't cause an impact. But the problem is we don't have enough habitats. So farmers putting out maybe a couple of lumps of sand, you know, a couple of piles of sand, like, you know, that mightn't, and if it's not done in the landscape or if the measures, I mean, I'm not even sure how effective that measure is, but, you know, like, so if it's done on a landscape scale, there shouldn't be an issue. Do you know what I mean? With some localized badger doing whatever he was doing at that lump, you know.
How do we know, say, you know, the corncrake and curlews and different birds, and you'll see that there was so many payers around the country. How did they come to those figures, would you tell me? Because, like, I know where those curlews and they're never counted.
Well, we want to know where those are, Deputy, so you'll have
But
to let us know. But so basically, there's a range of surveys that happen nationally, for especially on the likes of curlew, but on other species too. The Breeding Bird Atlas was conducted, and I think it was published in 2013, and that would have been based on the survey work done by volunteers through citizen science, but skilled volunteers who know what they're looking out for and who can recognise the signs of breeding activity, for example. So that's pretty much how it would be done, and I'm sure there was probably some population modelling as well included in that.
Has there any study been done under the new, on the, say, it's actually rolled over at the moment, the GLASS scheme, where the wild bird cover was sown every year? Did that help the situation, or is there any? There
was no evaluation of that, and actually that's something we called for, and it's really important that when we're undertaking measures that there's some way to monitor if it's having a result. However, we do know anecdotally that the wild bird covers certainly in certain areas increased the local, the passerine, the small bird population, and then birds of prey also benefited from the wild bird cover as well, because they'd eat the small birds, so it helped with the food chain. But we would really hope that monitoring and evaluation of all these schemes is done so that we know that money is being used for the best possible result.
In fairness to the new REAP scheme, because I know a couple of people that's got into it, the meadow, there's an option there of cutting, as you've talked about, the meadow from the middle out, or cutting the silage or the hay, whatever you want cutting. And it is at a later date, I think in July or
July
something.
15th, I think.
I presume you welcome that's in the REAP scheme, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah, we would indeed.
And in relation to organic, there's a problem. Look at, you talked about 20,000 hectares of trees every year. I think anyone that thinks that, being realistic, when I sow at the moment, I think 4,500, is it, or 2,500 last year, hectares of trees. I think what we should do is look at a holistic view of this. There's an opportunity, and I've talked about it many times. If you can incentivize farmers, just think of 130,000 farmers in Ireland, and each single farm payment application is something like 32 hectares or so, around that. And just think that if you can get 1,000 trees is an acre generally, if you could get each one of them, and I know that there'll be bigger ones and smaller ones, I'm just averaging it out. If you can get each one of them to put in 1,000 trees in the next few years, haven't we achieved 130,000 acres of trees that will do an awful lot of good, which is about 50,000 hectares of a win that we can have between now and the end of CAP. And I think we should encourage the farmers, and I'm not saying you put them all together. You can put them down by a ditch, the way they won't be actually, if a farmer, for the want of a better word, say it, that they won't be interfering with them, that they can sow them in different places that will help the biodiversity, but also that it won't be inhibiting a small farmer. And I think that is one scheme, and the eco scheme, in my opinion, will help a lot under the new CAP in that. And I think we should be, it's a low-hanging fruit, in my opinion, that we can get, but I think that thinking that we're going to, plant 20,000 hectares of trees for the next 10 or 15 years, I don't know where we'd want to start making more land, in my opinion, or a lot of people won't be farming. And Fintan, I just heard one comment, because I was listening to you on the phone after the voting. To be honest about it, and I call it straight to you because I don't believe in beating around the bush, if you think that farmers around this country, that some of them with spades, and they went down with what you call stone shores years ago in small farms, and then they went along and they shored it or gravel tunneled it, like, there's dairy cows in Kerry, or there's a lot of the west of Ireland is shored land, and you know the terrain probably better as good as I do. Well, telling them that they'll be re-wetting it is like a red rag to a bull, and anyone that comes out with that, it won't wash, because if you go telling a farmer that has 30, 40, 50 acres, that the piece down the end of the field, that they're all their life, it's like, there's a saying in the countryside, it's like, bad land is like trying to tame a wild duck, it's hair done. And if you think that they're going to go back and let the land that they've, you know, blood, sweat and tears with a lot of them, go back into wild after the fighting with it all its life to keep it right, I think it's not a runner, I'll be honest with you. I think we need to look at other solutions, but I do think that that's not a runner. But look, I want to thank you for coming in. I think the AOS scheme, there was planting of trees and that in it. There was under the old REP scheme. Under the eco scheme, I think it's 4% has to be done for biodiversity to actually qualify for CAP.
Up to 10%.
Yeah, but a minimum.
Oh yeah, the condition, gate, yeah.
And then you have to do your eco after that.
Mr. Kelly wants to come in 10, so somebody.
Yeah, no problem.
Mr. Kelly?
Could I respond to the 2 points Deputy Fitzmaurice made on the forestry targets and the re-wetting of organic land targets? I come from the same neck of the woods as the deputy, so we'll both speak straight to each other. It's our way. I suppose I was quoting those particular targets because they are targets that have been put forward by the Climate Change Advisory Council, and I suppose one of our jobs as environmental NGOs is to analyse these various different policy drivers or policies that might be adopted by the government, and try and give a view then of what the environmental impacts of that might be, or what the socio-economic impacts might be, and try and give some advice or indication of what the best pathway forward might be. So look at that particular target for forestry. I totally agree with Deputy Fitzmaurice that the target of, I think it was 200,000 hectares or something per annum, based on the track record of afforestation figures, that seems totally unfeasible. I'd also like to put on record that us as environmental NGOs, based on the current model of forestry we have in this country, we would not be supportive in any way of a rollout of that forestry type across the country. We think it would have devastating impacts on biodiversity, water quality and the socio-economic well-being of many rural communities. I suppose what we would say is, having looked at what the Climate Advisory Council is saying, is that if we were going to achieve anything like those figures, we need to see radical change in the type of forestry that we plant, and it needs to be informed by science on what the best tree is in the right place and under the right management. And I think there needs to be real engagement with communities, because the planting figures we're seeing, people will vote with their actions, and what people are saying basically with their behaviour is that they don't like the forestry model that we have. So I agree 100% with the deputy on terms of the feasibility of the figures. On the re-wetting of agricultural soils, I also agree with the sentiment that there would be massive resistance to the reclamation of improved agricultural land. And I suppose that's one of the points we're making here today, is that we see these targets, we see these ambitions, we don't see how the government is proposing to implement them. We see the constraints. We also see the opportunities. My colleague Una Duggan talked a lot about the conservation status of breeding waders. Obviously, returning some of that land to a wetter condition or to wetland would have massive benefits for biodiversity, for climate change and for water quality. And if farmers do have to go up their lands, and if they have to return it to a wetland state or to a lower intensity of management, we think that they should be compensated. And I suppose to go back to your earlier point about the purpose of CAP, I think whilst CAP was originally designed to be a system to subsidise food production, I actually think the CAP we have now is much fairer for farmers, because it actually reflects the multiple goods and services that farmers provide to society. And so if a farmer who is managing land, reclaims land at the moment, if that farmer is then incentivised or rewarded for managing it less intensively, and they're happy to do that, and it delivers certain public goods and services, I think that's a win-win. we're not saying that, you know, that because we say something that farmers should be dictated to and that their land should be taken off them and the ditches should all be blocked overnight. We're saying there's a real need to recognise the scale of change that is required, and a need for engagement, for an open dialogue, and for everyone to learn from each other. We've got our perspectives. Every time we engage with farmers, we learn something. They're environmentalists as well, and they're experts as well, you know. And I suppose that's our message, is just that there's indications that there's a need for massive change, and that the CAP that we see isn't capable of delivering that, and that we basically need to see a better roadmap of how we're going to get to where we need to be and bring everyone together.
Yeah,
Mr. Kelly, you know, I just want to agree with Deputy Fitzmaurice. Land that has been reclaimed and with blood, sweat and tears over generations. Like, we all agree we have challenges to meet in climate change, and we have to adapt, but that will be a cul-de-sac. Farmers just will not go there. That will not happen, and it just won't happen. And it has cost an awful lot of money to bring it into productive land, and a lot of pride by farmers in getting it there. And we have to meet our challenges, but we'll have to find another route to do it, because rewritten productive land that has been done over generations to get into that state, that will not happen. Deputy Fitzmaurice?
Yeah, just on the forestry one, I think there's a win. It's I think Finton, it's 8,000 hectares a year is the target, and I'm correct in the climate action plan. And I think that if you look at the figures I threw out there, and I've said it to a few ministers before, if there's 130,000 farmers and we get, say, 1,000 trees over a few years, so on, in the next cap, it's like something like 45 or 50,000 hectares. It's 50,000 or 55. And if your target was 8 a year, you have nearly 7 to 8 years achieved if you get that. Along with, we also need, you know, a certain amount of planting to make sure that we're for planting commercial. Yeah, you know, we just cannot. But I'm talking about the farmer down with the ditch, and the group that was in earlier on, we're talking about the whitethorns and breasting the trees like we were years ago, and getting. You know, I think there's a lot of that farmers are willing to do, in all fairness to them, and I think that is workable. Like the Climate Action Council, it might be no harm in one of them if they came out on the ground and saw the reality. You know, you can put out all the figures you want. I think that you need to look at where you can have a win to get things moving. I believe that with working with farmers, as you've pointed out, Finton, that we can. That's one thing under the likes of the eco scheme or something on the new cap that there can be a win. I don't think on the as Deputy Carl has said, I don't think on the other. I think that they'd want to, if they went down the country and said that to an farmer, they'd get a bit of a shock. Okay. But that's all I have to say. Look at it, and thanks for coming in to you all.
Deputy Carty's waiting again. I just want to ask one question about ground nesting birds and the predators that are out there at the moment. And I'm specifically talking about mink and buzzards. And mink are a non-native species, and they are doing serious harm both to bird life and to hares and other species that are having, any animal that's having its young on the ground in supposedly an unprotected area. Have you any views on how that can be controlled or curtailed? Or, like, and definitely in our parts of the country, mink is a serious issue as regards wildlife.
Thank you, Chair. To be honest, we know that mink are having localised impacts in some areas, but in our view and assessments, it's not the #1 issue to address when it comes to helping ground nesting birds. That's providing habitat for them and for working with farmers to help them with their habitat. But yes, there are predators out there that do have an impact, but they would be more in the line of corvids and foxes. And that's one of the reasons why we need to be very careful about also where we put trees, so that because trees provide cover for foxes and crows, and So we really need to make sure that trees aren't put in places that are important for ground nesting birds, because otherwise we're going to lose even more of them. So that's one issue. There's no issue in relation to buzzards. Buzzards are not a threat to our ground nesting birds. So the main diet of buzzards is rats, rooks and rabbits, the 3 R's. And so we would not consider them a threat to ground nesting birds, just so you're aware.